It's now 11:50, so I will get cracking on the session. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. If you joined yesterday and today, great. What we're going to be covering in this session is just a deep dive into the types of centralisation that we see across the sector and across our customer base, and just functionally how they work, both from a systems perspective with IMP and also just from a broader perspective in terms of finance team structures. Just before we get into the useful stuff, as a sponsor, we get to introduce ourselves. So Imp Software, we provide budgeting software that helps you with your forecasting, your monitoring, and all of the core reporting across your multi-academy trust. So we only work with multi-academy trusts. We don't work with schools, and therefore we can be really specific to the needs and the requirements of multi-academy trusts. We're a couple of years old, nearly. We're working with a big range of trusts, and actually it's these trusts that have given me the examples that I'm going to be talking through today to explain how they're starting to operate and how their operating models are evolving as we go through. I mentioned earlier about a white paper that we're producing, which is the one on the right, around a growing philosophy, how our multi-academy trusts developing their operating models. Please use the link in the chat to register for that if that's of interest. And on our website, you'll find a blog around actually what are people doing. So therefore, how many people have centralised, how many are gag pooling, and some of the findings around how they're finding things. But today is going to be focused on the how rather than the what. And there are 5 models that I'm going to be talking through, and I've given them a name that is hopefully applicable to their position, and it just gives me something to call this setup. But the reality is whilst I'm going to talk about these 5 structures, the challenge with these sessions and the challenge for all of you guys, if you're looking at your operating models, is there are no 2 trusts that are doing this in the same way. So for us at IMP, we're just trying to give as much information and as much guidelines and outlines of models that people are using, so that you guys within your trusts and with your own local context, your own values and culture, how that can then be applied to some of the things that other trusts are doing. But we don't have a view on what's good, what's bad. Obviously there's some pros and cons of all of them, but we really just want to share with you the information around what these models can look like. So the first one, the traditional mat. I'm still very pleased with that animation. Traditional mat is now, out of these three centralized models, I'll talk about the later 2, which are gag pooling, but centralized mat, centralized budget planning, this is now probably the 3rd most widely used structure. And this is in really broad terms, but we're seeing less of these now than we perhaps did a year ago, and certainly 2 years ago. And with a traditional mat, what this means is that there is a CFO. So there is a central person generally that sets the direction, is responsible for budget assumptions across the trust. Schools are then responsible for pretty much everything else. So they're responsible for all of the processing within the finance system. They are responsible for all of the budget setting, defining what the budget need is, outlining that budget requirement, monitoring then as we get into the year against those budgets, and also producing reports for their local stakeholders, and also to go back to the trust. So that is, so yes, there's somebody centrally setting the direction, but actually it's pretty much a school-led process. School finance teams, school finance people are doing the majority of both the budget and the finance. So budget setting, ongoing maintenance, reporting, monitoring, and very heavy responsibility for finance. Potentially less likely with now centralized bank accounts are quite common, but potentially a bank account in each school as well. We've got a lot of customers that operate in this way. So whilst we talk about centralization and gag pooling and all the rest of it, actually still a big chunk of our customers still operate in a fairly traditional way. But what we can do to add to that is to really help that central person or the central assumptions be controlled and actually embedded into each of those schools' budgets. So if you think about pay scales, if you think about assumptions around increases, pay awards, pay progression, if you think about funding assumptions, pupil number projections, and also central big ticket items around pay and pensions grant, top slice, RPA, pupil premium, free school meals, universal infant free school meals, and 101 other things that can go onto this list. often these are decided as a trust. So this is our approach to these items. What we do at IMP is to empower that person to be able to actually implement those assumptions across all of their schools consistently. So therefore they're confident that all of the schools have inherited the exact assumptions that the trust want. But other than those central assumptions, schools are very much responsible for each of those items then at a local level. The next one then, which is now I think just about ahead in terms of the favorite. Okay, so in terms of our customers, this is probably the most common model that we have, where we call it a centrally led map. And what that means is that there's still school finance staff, and there's still school finance staff creating, maintaining and defining local budgets, and schools will still continue to initiate financial transactions. So that is purchase orders, requisitions, bankings, student transactions, cash management. And whatever the model, you're never going to get away from student-led transactions being initiated at school. Okay, if little Johnny comes to reception and says, I've got a problem with my dinner money, they're probably not going to be put through to a central dinner money team in the head office. Okay, that school level work with students and parents, you're just never going to get away from that. Yes, cashless systems can help, but you're always going to have a big element of transaction initiation at school level, because they know the students, they know the parents, and also they know the needs at a local level. But what we start to see changing at this stage is that budget monitoring, forecasting and reporting is generally then focused more centrally. So central teams are getting involved in both creating and maintaining these processes. And on the finance bit at the bottom, you see that there's probably less financial involvement. So unlikely to have a bank account at school level. Treasury functions of financial processing around purchase orders, banking and VAT is likely to be done centrally. And how this then works in IMP is that all of those things can be done by the central team. And what IMP offer to these customers is the ability to draw that line wherever that is suitable based on their finance policy. Okay, so if it's schools can do this and central team can do this, whatever that relationship is, and that relationship is different in every single trust, we just make sure the system is set up around whatever arrangement or structure is in place at the schools. A slight evolution of that, and one that is less popular, not as many people have got here, and it's quite similar to the centrally led map, is a centralized map. And what this generally looks like, and with all of these things, it's very general and broad, but we would expect to see less finance being processed within schools, and less finance, probably accountability and finance responsibility in schools. So we would see the central finance team then liaising with local head teachers, who obviously contribute hugely to the budget setting process, but actually that process is initiated, defined and maintained by central staff, even across all of those schools. Transaction initiation doesn't really change between a centralized MAT and a centrally led MAT. Finance, orders, invoices, sales invoices, banking and students, still going to be done at school level, but we just see a slight change on the budget setting to say the school isn't setting the budget, it's the trust setting the budget in conjunction with local heads. And often there might be a lead finance or a lead business manager at the school, but has less probably responsibility for finance. We also then provide kind of read-only access to heads, so heads can really get stuck into the budget. They can review all of their reports, they can review their staffing structure and those staffing assumptions over multiple years, but that line is drawn wherever is suitable. So it's quite a similar structure to centrally led MAT, but there's just a slight difference in who defines and puts together the budget, whether that's at school level or in a centralized MAT, that's going to be more at a central level. Moving that forward then to GAG pooling. Okay, GAG pooling, again, from the session I did yesterday, has loads of different applications, but I'm going to come up with two that are at kind of each end of the spectrum. Okay, and both of these models of GAG pooling that we deal with within our customer base, they're generally in addition to the centralized MAP finance structure. So therefore quite centrally heavy involvement in the budget setting and the budget reporting and structure. But then in terms of the budget management, so in this one here, we call it the family mat. And that's because, you know, we've done one of the interviews we did in the white paper is around this trust. And they've very much gone down the route of it's a family of schools. So they've got, the CEO always says, well, as far as I'm concerned, I've got one school with multiple campuses, and they very much treat it like that for budget management purposes. And you know, he will also say that, look, I've got 3 children. I've got 3 children at home. I don't spend an equal amount on all of them. I spend what I need to spend on each of the child at that particular point. So overall, all children are looked after equally, but actually the resources going into each one at any particular time vary. This is a smaller trust. You know, this is, I think this one's 4 schools. I can see that there'll be some challenges with this model as trusts grow, but a really sensible option in one sense that we've seen applied for all the right reasons. What this also does is makes things much simpler on the finance processes. So if you think within a 4-school trust traditionally, you'd have to itemize a budget from each school, put together the budget for each school, do all the transactions at school level, and then put together all reports school by school by school. This trust doesn't report on individual schools. Okay, as far as they're concerned, all of their reporting is centrally led reports, and all of that transaction load in the finance system and all of the budget workings are held against the central location. The only exception to this is that where they've got optional local services, so that might be lettings, it might be catering, after school clubs, breakfast clubs, trips, where it's kind of an optional service where they need to ensure that they're washing the face in terms of, you know, covering costs and actually contributing to central and not drawing from central. They do still process actuals and budgets at a local level on these optional areas. Question number 5, I think I've got 3 minutes to go. I've never been through 5 models in 15 minutes, but hopefully it's making some sense. Then the last model, again, centralized map from an operating perspective, but this is then GAG pooling, and rather than a family approach to this, they've taken the view that they're going to revise the ORPU model. Okay, and the reason they've revised the ORPU model is twofold. One is they're across 10 local authorities, and therefore the funding varies quite widely between each of those, and they found that it was very difficult to then compare their schools and actually have meaningful conversations on a benchmark basis because there was just such a variation of funding. So what this trust have done is they've implemented their own funding model where all of the factor 1 funding, so, you know, ORPU predominantly, gets pulled into the centre. Everything else on the funding statements are around the lump sum, deprivation, you know, any of those local factors remain at school level. So actually that helps flatten it out based on deprivation differences and actually some of those contextual factors. But they pull all of the GAD funding into the centre, and then they remove central costs and also remove surplus targets. So they've got reserves targets that they've set centrally as a trust through their trustees. And then they take those things out and then they know what's left, and they then divvy that back out based on a calculation. So it's, you know, based on pupil numbers, it's based on a few other factors, but they say, right, this is the available funds, this is the number of students that we've got in primaries and secondaries, and therefore I'm going to divvy that back out. So then each school has a per pupil funding rate pushed back out once some of those central things have been removed. And what this effectively does is splits the budget 70%, 30%. So, you know, with all of things taken into account, broadly there's a 70-30 split. Education budgets are held locally and accountable at school by school level. And then the 30% of the budget, which is operations, which covers HR, admin, premises, estates, any of those things, are then managed and defined and monitored centrally. So they've got the budget in IMP set up, so school people and head teachers can run reports against the 70% in each of their schools. Their head of estates or head of HR can actually look and manage their budgets across all of their schools, and never the two shall meet. So then from a trust perspective, they're looking at the operations as one set of reports and education as another. And this funding mechanism is baked into IMP. So therefore, as and when things change, whether that's pupil numbers, whether that's deprivation factors or reserves targets or central cost figures, this calculation is always ongoing within IMP. So it's always recalculating and staying up to date. So they know that actually this is a revising, self-generating calculation, knowing that all of their budgets are in balance across, in this case, all of their 20 plus schools, which is, you know, very different model to the family MAT, which was very different to the centralized MAT or the centrally-led MAT or the traditional MAT. Again, the key is everybody does it very differently. Those are 5 examples. Lots of people are somewhere in between, but hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea of how trusts are starting to operate as they move through their centralisation journey, and also how IMP's philosophy is that we will fit around wherever you are on that journey, because the reality is nobody's fully school-led, very few people are fully centralised, most people are somewhere in between, and it's at that point where systems can struggle, and we know wherever you are on that journey, you can be supported with IMP. Hopefully that was interesting. I think I'm bang on time. We've done a number of sessions around centralisation, around MAT finances. You can find them if you look for the MAT Finance Show on YouTube, Spotify, and iTunes. You can listen to any of those sessions. Please register for any of those white papers, and please book a one-to-one session, drop us an email, visit our website, and look forward to hopefully catching up with all of you individually. Thank you very much.